Good morning, everybody. Just doing another installment of Chroma Live. Just here to answer any screen making questions, emulsion questions that you guys have. And we'll dive right into it. So just please put your questions in the live chat, and I'll address them as they come. I've had some other questions come in via email this week because they wouldn't be able to make it to the live feed here today. So I'll address those throughout the session as well. And I think actually I'll start with one that came in via email. This is a question from Raquel. She says, I use CP Tex emulsion for water-based inks, and they have a shelf life of 3 to 4 weeks after I sensitize it. As a small home-based business, I spend way too much on emulsion for something that doesn't last that long. So that being the case, do you recommend a different emulsion for a longer shelf life? And how would this affect my burn times? So one thing right off the bat that I would recommend, if you're a small shop and you love using CP Tex, instead of buying it in a full gallon and sensitizing a full gallon, I would buy it in quarts. Buy it in a smaller container like a quart, mix it up, and then you've got 4 to 6 weeks to use a quart instead of a gallon. If you want to continue to buy in gallons because you can make it a little bit cheaper, obviously a gallon is going to be a little bit cheaper per volume. Something like our Chromatech WR, our DTS Z1, these are pure photopolymers that are water resistant. Exposure times will be much faster, probably about half the time of something like CP Tex being a diazo-based emulsion. But with those emulsions being pure photopolymers and you don't have to mix the diazo in, they have about a 2-year shelf life instead of that 4 to 6 weeks. So a much larger window of opportunity to use that product before it starts to go bad. But that's kind of where I would lead somebody in that direction. Got a couple questions coming in here. Lucy, when using a diazo sensitized emulsion, how do I know if I have mixed it properly? So the biggest thing to look for is just to make sure it's homogeneous. Make sure it looks very uniform throughout. It's all the same color, all the same consistency. When you're mixing in the diazo with the water, you'll notice obviously the diazo and the water solution is a different color than the mix of the emulsion that's in there. So as you stir it together, you'll see it all becomes one homogeneous color, and you'll see that the water and the diazo is obviously much thinner than the emulsion in the bucket. So you just want to make sure it's all the same consistency, the same color. So just make sure you just keep mixing it thoroughly. And then after it's mixed, be sure to let it sit at least a couple hours to degas. After all those bubbles release, I like to do just an easy mix through it once again, and then you can start coating your screens. But you don't want to coat it too soon because all those bubbles, if they form on the screen after you coat your screen, that's going to lead back to pinholes instead of just bubbles releasing in the bucket. Good question. Ollie, what are the benefits of screen printing textiles versus sublimation? So the biggest thing between screen printing and sublimation is sublimation can only be used with polyester. So it has to bond with that polyester to sublimate into those fibers. Where screen printing, you can screen print on absolutely anything. Now you might have to use different types of inks, whether it's plastisol or silicone or water-based. You might have to use different inks or different additives in those inks, but you can screen print virtually on anything. Whereas sublimation, you have to use something like polyester because it has to actually sublimate into those fibers. Sean, can you talk about building up stencil thickness for specialty printing? Yeah, so that's a great question too. One thing I like to use, we've got a product that's called fat film. It's a high density film. It ranges between 100 microns thick all the way up to 700 microns thick. And you would apply that to your screen using direct emulsion from the back side. We've got some videos on our website of the application process, and I would recommend taking a look at those videos, those instructional videos on chromaline.com for the application process, but it's a very consistent process. When we're coating that fat film industrially on our end, we have that thickness. If it says that it's a 300 micron piece of fat film, it's going to be 300 microns every time. There's direct emulsions that you can use. So I've got customers. I'll give a shout out, Mad Specials over in Amsterdam. He does all kinds of crazy stuff and really good high density prints, special effects printing, but he uses Chroma Blue for all of his printing. So he's got a kind of a proprietary process that he uses, but you can use direct emulsions, whether it's you coat your screen, let it dry, come back, coat it again with face coats on the bottom side of that screen, let it dry, coat it, let it dry. This can be a long process, but you can continue to build up your stencil build with a high solids emulsion like Chroma Blue over time through a process like that. But if you use something like fat film, you can get that high density stencil build very easy, very quick, and it's going to be far more consistent than using direct emulsions as well. I'll dive into another one that I got online. Patrick asked, so he was shooting his screens in the basement, and then he was bringing them upstairs to wash them out. But what he was doing is he was shooting them in the basement, and then he would get them wet, thinking that it would stop the exposure time. So his question was, getting the screen wet, does that stop the exposure process and prevent it from exposing more? And the answer is no. Even though the screen is wet, light can still affect that screen. So if you're shooting a screen in a dark, light-safe environment, and then you get it wet, and then you bring it out into the light, whether it's outside to wash it out or in anywhere else in your house or your shop that there's a bunch of white light, even though it's wet, the UV light can still get through that water and still penetrate the emulsion and continue to cross-link that emulsion. So your best bet would be to shoot it, keep it dry, put it in a black plastic bag and bring it into the other area, wash it out. But best bet, where you wash out your screens should be in a light-safe environment as well. That entire screen-making area should be under light-safe environment. Obviously, you can get away with doing things not perfect practice, but in a perfect world, you're going to want your entire screen-making area in light-safe conditions. Another question from Lucy. Can you mention what device you recommend to test the tension of a screen? Where can I find one? Yeah, any of the mesh manufacturers have them, or any of your local suppliers would have them as well. But the one that I like the most is manufactured by CFAR. It's the Stencil Check 100. It doesn't have a spring in that system, so a lot of the tension meters that are out there have a spring and it gets worn out over time. But that is all based on a weight system, and it's a digital scale as well. It's far more expensive, but it is the best. The other ones that are out there, they're going to get close, but it's not going to be as accurate as that Stencil Check 100 will be. But once again, it's far more expensive, but it is the best. You get what you pay for in most things. Another question by Ali. Are there leasing options available for an automatic screen coater? So we don't have leasing options at Chromaline specifically, but I know there's a lot of third-party leasers out there, so you can work with leasing companies, any of the third-party leasing companies that are out there. Otherwise, a lot of our suppliers that we sell through have partnerships with these leasing companies. So they would be a great option and would be able to help you out with those as well. But specifically, any of the leasing companies, I wouldn't mention them by name just because we don't have a partnership specifically with any of them. But I know there are a lot of different options out there. Gus, I'm currently using Chroma Blue and Chroma Lime. What do you recommend for halftones? And is it 1 and 1 coating? Home shop. Okay, so Chroma Blue and Chroma Lime are going to be extremely similar products. They're both pure photopolymers. They're both high-end solids. How you coat those screens is really going to help you out with those halftones. So you asked, is it a 1-in-1 coating all the time? I typically do a 1-in-1 coat all the time with Chroma Blue and Chroma Lime. But what I usually recommend is on the scoop coater, got one right here. On one side of the scoop coater, there's a sharp profile edge, and the other side, there's a rounded profile edge. I like to use the rounded profile edge, coating 1-in-1, everything, say like 156 and below, with that rounded edge 1-in-1. Last pass, always from the squeegee side. No matter what, when you coat your screens, the last pass should always come from the squeegee side. But for that rounded edge with Chroma Blue or Chroma Lime, I coat screens 1-in-1 with the rounded edge 156 and below. And then anything above that, your 185 screens, your 230 screens, I typically will use the sharp edge 1-in-1, because with the rounded edge on those higher mesh counts, you're going to be putting too thick of a stencil build for the fine details that you're trying to resolve. So when you talk about halftones, a lot of times you'll be doing that on the higher mesh counts because you're trying to resolve finer details, smaller, finer halftones. And with the 1-in-1 with the sharp edge will give you a little bit thinner of a stencil and will help you resolve those fine details much easier. Great question. This is probably an age-old question, but does yellow mesh increase or decrease emulsion cure time compared to white mesh? Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people think, white mesh, yellow mesh, it doesn't make a difference, but it makes a huge difference. So I know for my time, I worked at CFAR, the mesh manufacturer, as their application specialist prior to my role here at Chromaline. And I can tell you that apples to apples, if you've got a 156 mesh yellow and you've got a 156 mesh white, coated the exact same way, same EOM, same emulsion, I would say the 156 yellow is going to be about double the exposure time of the 156 white. So what happens is the UV light goes into those yellow threads, and those yellow threads actually absorb that light. With the yellow threads, the light will go into those threads and will actually bounce around all over from the inside of that thread outwards, and you're going to get light scatter. So when it goes into those threads, it's almost like a fiber optic cable. As the light goes into that fiber optic and travels through that fiber optic cable, that light passes through there. And the same with white threads, but it bounces around and exposes from the inside as well as the outside. That's why a lot of the times you'll see most of the lower mesh counts are always going to be white mesh, but you start to get into those higher mesh counts like 230 mesh. Typically, you only see them in yellow mesh. I personally wish there was only yellow mesh, but I understand that it's not as readily available on those lower mesh counts. But with those higher mesh counts, say 230s, you're trying to resolve finer detail, sharper edge definition to do those finer details. And because of that, that's the reason why you're only seeing yellow mesh on those higher mesh counts, typically at least. You can get them, but most of the time it's special order or whatnot. Lucy, again, do I need to use an exposure calculator for every screen if I'm using the same emulsion on multiple screens? Not every screen, obviously, but every screen build. So if you're doing if you've got a 110 mesh, and you've got a stencil build, you coat that 1-in-1 with a particular emulsion, that particular stencil build, you should use an exposure calculator on every screen build. So if you're using 110, 156, and 230, I would do an exposure calculator on every one of those stencil builds because each one is going to be different. Afterwards, you can look at those times and you can kind of fudge the numbers. There's exposure latitude built into all of our emulsions, so you can be above that perfect time or below that perfect time and still have a properly exposed stencil. So what I like to do is do an exposure calculator on every screen build. So even if you have 110s, in your 110s, you've got some that are coated 1-in-1, and you've got some 110s that are coated 2-in-1, Both of those should have an exposure calculator test done on them, so you know what the proper time is. Write those times down, and then you can kind of look if there's, if they're off by a few seconds or a few light units, you can kind of split the time on some of them. But know that you'll have much fewer problems if you use a specific time for every stencil build that you have. Yes, you can fudge the numbers and kind of split times, and that helps with production. If you've got a 110 screen and a 156, if those times are relatively close and you want to shoot them at the same time in your exposure unit, you can split that time. But just know one's going to be slightly over, one's going to be slightly under. But just keep that in mind. If you have problems going forward, you're going to probably want to expose those in batches. Annie, how do I do a step test? Yeah, so a step test. So I mean, like I said, the exposure calculators, like this is the easiest way. It's got a filter on there. But for doing a step test, if you don't have one of these exposure calculators, you can do a step test anywhere, anytime with your film, or even with the exposure calculator. Say you lose this little filter that's on there. This is the most important part of the exposure calculator. If you lose this, gone, and you just have this film, you can do what's called a step test. And with a step test, you would take that film, you tape it to your screen, and you can do this with absolutely any film, any of your films that you're using in production. And then what you'll do is you'll have something that blocks light, a piece of cardboard, anything that's going to block light, and you're going to block off a good portion of that film, leaving off one step open. Shoot this for a given amount of time, whether it's 10 seconds, 10 light units. And then what you'll do is you'll shoot it for that 10 seconds or whatever time that you want. Move this down, shoot for that same time again, 10 seconds again. Move it down, 10 seconds again, 10 seconds again, 10 seconds again. And that time, like I said, is just an arbitrary time that I'm just saying for example right now. Obviously, it needs to fall within the range of the proper exposure time. So something that's fast exposing like Chroma Blue on a white mesh on this 110, 10 seconds is probably going to be good. So then at the end, what you really have is you've got one step that's at 10 seconds, one at 20 seconds, 30, 40, 50. You take this off, go and wash it out as you normally would, and then you're going to look to see which one of those steps looks the best. It's got the best resolution, the best edge definition, and that's going to be your proper exposure time. That's going to be the hardening point of the emulsion. Typically what I do is at that perfect step that you find doing the step test, I'll usually add about 10% to that. So say the third step on there looked perfect, 30 seconds, I would add 10% to that. So I'd add 3 more seconds. So 33 is where I would set that. Ray, how do I know if I've overexposed my screen? Yeah, so overexposure. Most people are underexposing their screens, but I'll say overexposure still does happen from time to time. And the biggest thing with overexposure would be is where your image area is, a lot of times that just won't wash out. But not necessarily does that mean that it's overexposed. It could be pre-exposed, which would be a completely different issue. But overexposure typically is going to mean that the image area just isn't washing out properly. But it could be a pre-exposed where this screen got hit by a white light before you went to expose it, and it's going to kind of be exposed over that outer layer, and it's just not going to wash out properly because of that. Or if your films just aren't printed dark enough, or if you're using something like vellum, that light can actually pass through that dark printed area. It could be just the fact that your film positive just isn't printed dark enough and isn't blocking enough of that UV light. So yes, overexposure, telltale sign typically is your image area just isn't washing out properly. I'll hit another one of these that I got emailed in. Steve had mentioned, I've been having problems with washing out. Sometimes the positive part of the stencil would turn to liquid and just fall out. But lately, screens wash out in chunks and sometimes stick to the rest of the exposed emulsion. Any tips? Yeah, so this is exactly what I was just touching on as well. That would typically mean pre-exposure. So as you're washing out your stencil, the image area should almost melt away and just kind of run out of the screen. But if you seem to have to expose or wash it out with a high pressure washer and really get up on it to just get through that stencil, and when you do get through there, it almost lifts off and peels away in chunks, like it's not melting away, but more peeling away. That's telling me that that outer layer of the emulsion has been exposed and has been affected by white light. So yeah, you can still get through that, but now you're having to punch through that hardened layer, which when it starts to peel away, a lot of times it'll grab the edge of your artwork as well, and you won't have as sharp of an image. So yes, typically that's going to lead back to pre-exposure. If it seems like it's peeling away or if it's coming off in chunks, it should just melt away when you're developing your screens, and it should develop very easily. Justin, what's the craziest thing you've seen screen printed? Like I said, you can screen print virtually anything. There's everything from, your iPhone. All the traces in there, all the electronics in there are screen printed in a lot of cases. So, I mean, there's just a vast range. It's not just, there's a lot of people that just think of screen printing as just screen printing on textiles, on t-shirts. But the electronics in your phone, your smartwatch, anything like that, architectural glass, there's many, many applications for screen printing. But, as far as craziness, I don't know if it's crazy, but for a lot of people that are in the textile industry, they're not thinking of the printed electronics world. To them, a lot of that just kind of blows their mind that a lot of the electronics are actually printed with conductive pastes, silver, gold, platinum. All of those traces are actually screen printed in a lot of the electronics that you use today. Sean again, I tend to stray away from capillary films because of price. Are there applications that it would make sense to use versus emulsion? I mean, so end result, if you're really good at coating screens and you're very consistent at coating screens with a direct emulsion, not necessarily would you have to use a capillary film. But I will say that capillary film is going to be far more consistent. For people that have an auto screen coater and are using an auto screen coater with direct emulsion, that's going to be extremely consistent. And you don't have to worry about variations from screen to screen. If you're hand coating your screens and you're not really good at it, some of those screens are going to be thicker and some are going to be thinner. If you use something like capillary film, this piece of capillary film is industrial coated, and I know that it's always going to be the same thickness every single time. So not only is it the same thickness going to help with your ink laid down, ink coverage, to know what you can expect, but also exposure times. Your exposure times are always going to be the same. If you're hand coating screens and some of your screens are 30 micron ZOM and some of them are 10 micron ZOM, that's a huge variation. And both those two screens won't be the same exposure time. But if you can keep all of your processes very consistent, it's not a big deal. But I will say with direct emulsion, there's far more waste. I mean, you fill this scoop coater up with emulsion. When you're done coating your screens, you scoop that back into the bucket, but there's always some emulsion left in here that you're rinsing out, and that's just waste. With capillary film, you apply this sheet to your screen, and there's no waste whatsoever. So yes, it might be a little bit more expensive per sheet, per screen, but I can say that there's less waste with capillary film. It's far more consistent, so chances are if you're not very good at coating screens, you're not very consistent in coating screens, you might have screens that are going to be rejects and are going to have issues on press. So the consistency is key. So you pay a little bit more for it, but the consistency, the less waste, all of those attributes of capillary film are definitely worth it, in my opinion. But for the most part, most people are using direct emulsion. I will say this: if you're just working out of home, you've got a home shop, it's a much cleaner process as well. Everybody that's coated screens with direct emulsion has made a mess at one time or another, and with capillary film, it's a completely clean process. Excuse me. So you can go back. I did a video on applying capillary film. I actually just applied capillary film right here in my office, right over the carpet, and I didn't get emulsion anywhere. If I were to hand coat emulsion, I wouldn't want to do that right here in my office in case I dripped it and got emulsion all on the carpet, because that can be a real pain to clean out. So there are pros to it, and you can almost justify that little bit more per price per screen based on the consistency and everything that goes along with that, and the less waste as well. We got Art. Is mesh tension important when coating direct emulsion? Absolutely it is. So if you've got screens that are, there's a magnitude of differences of why, but I'll say the biggest thing is, say you've got screens that are high tension, same mesh count. So you got a 156 and a 156, one's at 30 newtons, the other one's at 15 newtons. That tension, the more tension that's on there, the more it's pulling on those threads and the thinner those threads are. So if you were to actually measure the fabric thickness on a screen that's much higher tension, you're going to see that your fabric thickness is going to be much thinner than a screen that's lower tension with a higher thickness. So the difference between those just alone will give you a variation from screen to screen. So also, when you are coating a screen that's high tension, you've got more control over how you coat that screen as well, from side to side. As you coat that screen, it's going to be far more even. If you've got a screen that's really baggy, it should be time to put it out to pasture and put it down. That screen that's real loose, real baggy, as you coat that screen, you don't have as much control side to side, so it's going to give you variations as well. But yes, screen tension does definitely play into your overall stencil thickness and how you coat those screens. So there's a lot of people that don't really check your tension on your screens, but it really does affect from screen to screen your tension, your overall stencil thickness, and that'll definitely change your exposure times from screen to screen as well, which obviously you're not going to do a different exposure time from screen to screen. Another thing that tension plays into as well is on press. If you've got some screens that are high tension, if you've got some screens that are lower tension, you have to have different off contacts between a high tension screen and a lower tension screen. You're actually going to be able to have a much lower off contact with a high tension screen than you can with a baggier mesh, a looser, lower tension screen. Because of those variations in off contact, now when the squeegee comes down and pushes that screen, when it has to push down further because you have a higher off contact, that's going to warp and distort your image. So when you're trying to line up a multiple color job, if they're not all the same tension or at least close, and you have all different off contacts, it's going to be very difficult for you to have proper registration. Good question, Art. Grab another one of these that came in via email. You talked about measuring EOM in the last video you did, but what if I don't have a fancy thickness gauge like the one that you use? How can I tell if I have enough emulsion on my screen? So yeah, I mean, not every shop has a stencil gauge or a stencil thickness gauge like I do. The Fisher Isoscope, I think it's a great gauge. I think it's a great tool to have. But even as somebody commented on the video, they looked this up and they saw it's pretty expensive. This thing is typically around $700 to $800. But if you're doing everything consistently, once Once us sales reps, manufacturer reps can get back out in the world and work with you in your shops once again, I have this, and I like to come around and I'll do this with you at your shop and tell you exactly if you coat your screen, this mesh count, this emulsion, this coating sequence in your facility, how you do it. We can measure it and see exactly what your screens are. And as long as you do everything consistently, it should stay pretty consistent. So it's not something that you need to continuously check, although it's nice. If you've got the ability to have one of these things, it'll definitely help. But one thing you can do just to know that you actually have enough emulsion on your screen is feel your screens. I can literally feel that lip, that edge on my stencil, that stencil build. You should feel that. On the lower mesh counts, you're going to feel it a lot easier because you're going to have a thicker stencil build than you will on your higher mesh counts, but you should still feel it. One way you can actually see that the difference is, now, like I said, always when you coat your screen, last pass should come from the squeegee side. Always dry your screens squeegee side up, so gravity is pulling that emulsion down to the bottom. All of your emulsion should be on the bottom side of that screen. So if you feel the bottom side of your screen, you should feel that edge of your artwork. If you go around to the other side, chances are you can't feel that. One thing that I do a lot of times when I'm at a shop is I'm always constantly touching screens, because you can tell a lot just by touching your screens. Now, a lot of times I'll go into a shop and I'll feel the bottom side of the screen and I don't feel anything whatsoever. I'll flip it around and I can feel stencil on this side. And I ask them, I go, how are you drying your screens, knowing that they're drying screens the wrong way, squeegee side down. If you're drying screens squeegee side down, all of the emulsion is going to go down to this side of the screen, and this side of the screen is not important when you're screen printing. This side of the screen, squeegee side, just holds ink, and as a mesh manufacturer, that has no bearing on the actual print itself. You want to have all of your stencil on the bottom side of that screen. So if you can feel a lip on the top and not on the bottom, chances are you're drying your screens the wrong way. But you should be able to feel your artwork. You should be able to feel that lip. And because of that, you wouldn't necessarily need a thickness gauge. A thickness gauge is great to tell you exactly where you are and what your EOM is at, but be sure you can at least feel that. If you can't, coat your screens with another pass so you can. Gus asks, will regular LED shop lights affect the emulsion, or should I turn off the lights while exposing? So I'll tell you this. There's a lot of different LED lights that are out there. They're all in different wavelengths, different ranges. If you think about it, LED exposure units are all the rage right now. So dependent on what your wavelength of your LED bulbs are, which chances are you probably don't know that with your regular shop lights. So I recommend still, even with LED lights, having a UV white filter. I've actually just worked with a shop right before everything hit and quarantine hit. Big shop, brand new operation, and they had yellow lights. They had LEDs in throughout their entire screen making area, but they only had a yellow UV filter where they're coating screens. After they coated those screens, they were bringing them into the other room where they would actually image them with their Delphic wax direct-to-screen unit, and then into their metal halide, their exposure unit. And so where they were imaging their screens and where they were exposing their screens was all under white light, under LED lights. And that top screen always seemed to be affected by that white LED lights. When they were washing that screen out, we knew before you'd even wash that screen out that it wasn't going to wash out as easy. So it was telling me that it was getting pre-exposed. So even with LED lights, even with the LED lights that you think are in the proper wavelength to not expose screens, some UV light is still getting to that screen and is still affecting that screen. So I recommend, even with LED shop lights, UV filters. Encapsulite.com. So that's ENCAP SULITE.com. So encapsulite.com. They have mesh. They've got filters in there, yellow UV filters that you can get in sheets or rolls, or the tubes that you can put right on your your tubes and put them into your light fixture. But you still want to be working under yellow UV light safe conditions, even with LED lights. So from Chroma line, looks like we've got some coming into the Facebook Messenger, some questions. Hey, Kevin, we have some other questions. Kenneth, is there a way to patch holes in my screen, or do I need to replace the entire screen on my frame? So, I mean, honestly, I'm assuming they're asking about if there's a hole in the mesh, not a pinhole in the emulsion. But yeah, if there's a hole in the mesh, in my opinion, that needs to be cut out and stretch a new screen, just because of the inconsistencies that you're going to have. You're going to have different tensions throughout that screen, and it's going to give you lots of problems. But I'll tell you, almost every shop that I go to has got screens that are patched with duct tape and whatever, and they'll keep using it and as long as they can. But honestly, in my opinion, I'm always talking about best case scenario, best practice, because you can, pardon my French, you can half-ass things, but you're always going to lead back to other problems. And that if you've got a screen that's going to give you problems on press, the down press time is going to cost you more money than it would if you were to just get a new screen. So if you get a hole in that screen, cut it out, remesh it, send it into your the company that you use to remesh screens, or just get a brand new one. But yeah, I typically recommend not patching those, just because it can definitely lead back to other problems. Chris, where do you recommend buy screen drying racks from? I need to hold a lot of screens from about 100 to 200. Yeah, so typical screen drying racks hold about 25 screens. You can get them from any of the distributors that we work with. And, I know GSF has got some good ones. So, I mean, I know that everybody's got good, has got a line on those. But any of your local distributors that you buy your supplies from, if they sell equipment, they should be able to help you out with a screen drying rack as well. Julie, do you sell software that I can use to make my artwork to then expose into my emulsion? So the software that we sell and we work with is RIP software. So that's like the filmmaker RIP software, which would be like the brains of your printer. It's going to dictate how much ink is laid down on the film, your halftones, the angle of your halftone, line count, all that good stuff. But as far as the artwork program, I typically recommend Adobe products. I'm an Illustrator guy. I know there's people out there that love Corel. That's one of those graphic design battles in the screen world, but I'm an Illustrator guy, so Adobe Illustrator for designing your artwork through the filmmaker RIP on the way to the printer. That's what I would recommend. And we can help you out with the filmmaker RIP and technical support on that, and we can sell you that RIP. But as far as the actual native art program like Adobe Illustrator, we don't sell that kind of stuff. I would recommend going to Adobe for that kind of stuff. Yeah. Had another one come through with email. I'm constantly fixing pinholes before the screen goes on press. Will a higher solids emulsion help with this? The answer is it's a possibility. Not necessarily by you using a higher solids emulsion are you going to have less pinholes, but by the nature of a high solids emulsion, you're going to be able to get a better stencil build much quicker. So chances are a better stencil build will give you fewer pinholes on press. So in turn, yes, typically a high solids emulsion will lead back to fewer pinholes, just because you're going to have more emulsion left on that screen after that screen dries. I did a video just this week as well. I would suggest jumping on here on my YouTube channel and checking out that video. But that discusses how there's solid content in your emulsion and your EOM, how they work together. But yeah, jump on there and take a look at that video. It really should explain that as well. But yeah, using a higher solids emulsion will help build your stencil quicker, thicker, much faster, which typically leads back to fewer pinholes. But there's way more variables in screen printing than just that. If you were to have a really thick stencil and underexpose that stencil, you're probably still going to have pinholes. Or if you work in a dirty print environment or you don't degrease your screens very well, even though you've got a high solids emulsion, it might cover up some of those imperfections. But you know, anything dirt, debris that's on your screen is going to lead back to pinholes as well. Yeah. Yeah, so it looks like questions are starting to slow down coming in here. I will continue to do these live Q&As as long as you want me to, even when we get back to the world and I'm out traveling around and seeing you face to face in your shops. I still want to continue to do this because I think it's a good way of being able to interact with far more people much quicker, all at the same time. And, you know, I think one good thing that this quarantine has done is it kind of has made us all evolve in how we think about how we do business going forward. And something like this, I think, can be beneficial even when we get back to the normalcy, whatever that's going to be, getting out there, working with you. I like getting hands-on, working with you guys in your shops. I like helping technically, seeing exactly what's going on in your process, which, you know, I can talk about perfect practice and I can talk all about that here, but everybody's shop isn't a lab setting. You know, everybody's shop is set up differently. So some of those processes and procedures need to be different for your shop versus your neighbor's shop. So that's why I like to get out and work with you guys. But yeah, I'm always happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to reach out to me anytime at kkauth@chromaline.com. That's KKAUTH@chromaline.com. You can email me questions anytime. You can find me on Instagram, Emulsion Guru. I'm happy to answer any questions through there anytime as well. Yeah, I'm glad this was helpful, guys. We got another question here. Kevin, what show are you binge watching now? We watched Tiger King. Joe's crazy. We need a new show to binge. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously there's all kinds of stuff out there right now. But I mean, obviously, as personal preference, I haven't really been doing too much watching of TV as of late. I watched Tiger King, got into that one. But as far as binge worthy goes, I don't have many other recommendations at this point. We've been watching another one called The Innocence Files. I believe that's on Netflix as well. So it just talks about people that have been locked away and find out 15 years later that they didn't actually commit the murder. And it's pretty interesting, eye-opening series as well. But anyways, but yeah, thanks guys. I appreciate you taking the time and hanging out with me for a while today. And I'll keep doing these videos. I'll keep doing other technical videos. So keep an eye out for those. Subscribe to the YouTube channel so you see when any new videos come out. And we'll see you guys soon. Take care, guys.